Good morning, Central Region. This is Bruce Smith from Central Region Headquarters, and we're ready to get started with our next in a series of NBM webinars we provided to all of Central Region as we continue down this path of leveraging the NBM as our common starting point and learning ways to work more smartly with the NBM going forward. So today's webinar will be focused heavily on looking at the feedback we've received thus far. Of course, we started soliciting feedback on the NBM starting June 4th after we switched from SuperBlend over to the NBM. So a lot of today's talk will focus on that feedback, but we'll also take an opportunity to look back at where we've been to get us to this point, and also looking ahead to the upcoming winter and some of the other initiatives related to the NBM that we'll be promoting for Central Region. So not exactly sure how long the webinar is going to take. It might take a little less than an hour, and regardless, we will have an opportunity for question and answer at the end. So certainly keep those questions in mind, and we will ask for those at the end of the webinar. The webinar, of course, is a joint venture, as all of these are here in Central Region, including our Central Region Grid Methodology team, our Central Region Culture team, and Central Region SSD. So all of us have played a role in kind of pulling this material together and continuing to lead NBM here in Central Region. So folks that will be on the call on those teams, either presenting and or available for Q&A at the end, would include three people from the field: Audra Henneke from Topeka, representing the Culture team, Jerry Wietenfeld from Milwaukee, and Chuck Greif from Jackson, Kentucky. They will represent the Grid Methodology team. And then here in the room, representing SSD, in addition to myself, Randy Graham, Andy Just, and Greg Noonan. Also in the room, for those that might be interested, would be our Regional Director, Chris Strager. He's mainly in listen mode, but he has also said that he would be available if there's any specific questions directed to him at the end of the call as well. So I wanted to make sure folks knew he was here, available for any questions. So to get us started, let's just take a quick look back at where we've been, promoting a common forecast starting point here in Central Region. Of course, moving toward a common starting point in the NBM is all codified pretty clearly within the Evolve initiative. The NBM was a key component of that. And then we took the lead from the Evolve initiative within our Central Region Weather Ready Nation Roadmap, version 1, which is coming to a close here within the next couple of months to be replaced by version 2, which you'll be hearing a lot more about. But of course, our first roadmap very clearly talked about offices utilizing a common starting point, quote unquote, and the NBM and SuperBlend certainly moved us down that down that path. And then additionally, we were tasked with exploring the National Blended Models as a foundation to serve as a common starting point as the NBM matures. And you can see there on the bottom of this screen the progression we've made from SuperBlend, a great regional initiative that served us very well for some period of time as we waited for the NBM to fully mature. There was consideration to move on to NBM version 3.0. A lot of pros and cons to that, and we decided to kick the can on that a little bit until the NBM matured a little more fully, and it has, and that was why we made the decision in June to go over to NBM version 3.1. And then looking beyond, as you can see, NBM 3.2 coming up this fall, currently set for, I believe, November 4th, and I think that's quite firm. Oftentimes these things get kicked forward a little bit, but I've not heard any rumblings to that effect at all. So I think that November 4th date is going to be pretty firm for NBM 3.2. And compared to 3.1, you're going to see some changes in how the wind fields behave, both wind speed and direction, which is a positive step forward that was based on feedback that Central Region provided to the NBM developers. You'll also see a change in how P-type is derived. We'll talk more about that later in today's webinar. And you'll also begin to see some new probabilistic fields. So those are things you can look forward to in November. And then looking farther ahead, NBM 4.0 will really release many more probabilistic fields. The details are still up in the air a bit, but that is slated for late next calendar year. No firm date, but that's tentatively what we're looking for. So you can see the progression, again, from SuperBlend into the NBM world over the last several years here in Central Region. Been a great initiative, a lot of folks working hard to make that happen, and we're looking forward to continuing down this path. So with that background, I will now pass it over to Audra Henneke, and she's going to talk a little bit about the importance of the feedback we've been receiving from all of you. It's really an important component to us improving the process, both the collaborative forecast process, how we work together, but also improving the NBM itself. So Audra, take it away.
Thank you, Bruce. As we continue this evolution of utilizing the NBM with our forecast process, it truly is a feedback-driven process. It's your feedback that ultimately is driving change. So if you are noticing that you're having to make adjustments to the output of NBM in order for it to align with your IDSS message, that's the sort of information that we want to continue to get feedback on and hear from you. And so by getting that feedback, filling out those surveys, allowing us to document those issues, that ultimately is what's going to help move us forward and hopefully making some changes to the NBM so it continues to meet our needs more and more. And so keep the feedback coming. It's a huge part of moving this process forward and implementing positive change. Ultimately, when it comes to the NBM, the desire is to utilize NBM for all weather elements that it provides. So as we continue to gather more feedback and we're continuing to monitor verification stats, as well as gathering examples that highlight issues that we're seeing in outputs from NBM, it's this information that ultimately is then provided on to the national teams as well as to the developers for potential fixes to NBM or even to the input data sets like IRMA or the HER, whatever the situation may be. That's where that feedback is going. So when it comes to Forecast Builder, if you're implementing changes, it really should be seen as simply a Band-Aid for right now until fixes are ultimately incorporated into the NBM or IRMA, whatever the issue may be. So moving forward here with our webinar today, the main focus here is breaking down the themes that we have received so far from the feedback. Great news is that we've already received over 200 responses of feedback since we transitioned to the NBM, which is fantastic. And that feedback has come from roughly 28 of our 38 WFOs. So this is fantastic news. We really appreciate the feedback and we strongly encourage you all to keep it coming as we continue to work toward evolving it and making continued improvements. Next slide, please. So here's a little visualization of when you're submitting that feedback, you might wonder, okay, where's it going? How is this information being utilized? Here's essentially the feedback chain. It starts off with those surveys, that receiving that forecaster feedback. So as you notice issues on your end, that's where you want to be putting that into the survey and submitting that. As we continue to gather those survey feedbacks, it's basically looked over and monitored by the CRGMAT team. And really what they're looking for is they're monitoring and gathering this feedback. They're really looking to hone in on identifying where are there impactful or systematic issues that are coming through in the NBM that really we need to focus on to get some resolution. So when they start identifying those key impactful systematic issues, the CRGMAT team is providing a summary of those issues as well as possible causes onto CRSSD, and from there Central Region SSD is communicating those issues and possible causes onto the national teams and onto the developers, and ultimately hopefully we are moving toward finding resolutions that can be made in the NBM for future releases down the road. So that's at least a little visualization of how we are gathering that feedback, utilizing that feedback and incorporating it to those that need to hear it so that we can bring impactful change to the NBM to improve the forecast process moving forward. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and toss it over to Andy and he will get into more of the specifics of some of the themes that we've gotten from our feedback so far.
All right, thank you, Audra. So I wanted to take a few minutes here and talk a little bit about the NBM, because there's been some common theme in the feedback that I've been receiving, and I think we need a little more, maybe a slightly more weeds into the NBM. So a big point here about the NBM is it's designed to create a reliable statistical forecast. It's really statistically calibrated, So when it's creating a 6-hour pop versus a 12-hour pop, it's going to take into consideration what's the chance of receiving 100th over a 6-hour period versus that over a 12-hour period. So when you think about it, you're probably more likely going to see a 100th over a 12-hour than over a 6-hour. So in the NBM, if you were to look at 12-hour pop, you're going to see higher values than you would for a 6-hour. Similarly, for the thunder grids, you're going to see higher values for 12-hour than you will a 3-hour. Furthermore, besides the 6 and 12-hour QPF and pop, the elements do not talk to each other. There's very little inter-element consistency type checks there, if you will, because again, it's playing the statistically reliable approach. And so, I know we've had feedback on this, about pop and sky, and so I'm going to go on my second bullet here, which is, we've always had this mantra of having some sort of inter-element consistency between like pop and sky, but is that correct? Is that the way we should actually have it? Just open your mind here a little bit. For example, what about this idea here, mostly sunny with a 40% chance of showers and thunderstorms? Is that a problem? That could be a typical diurnal convection day or due to uncertainty. Another case, this is in the temperature fields. You look at your hourly temperatures, and the max of those is only 95, but your actual high temperature grid shows 98. A good point here is that hourly temperatures, based on what they are in our directive, is supposed to be the temperature at the top of the hour, whereas the high temperature is supposed to depict that highest temperature that would be observed. Thinking about this, I know there's been discussion about what about the MPW when you got communicate the highest heat index. Well, your highest heat index may not actually occur at the highest of your actual apparent temperature grids, because those are just at the top of the hour. So, these are these interesting things about the NBM, that it's you're looking at each weather element created essentially by itself. And another point that I think needs to be made here about the NBM, because it's a statistical model, we got to understand about distributions. And one of the problems that we have with the NBM right now is that we can only visualize a small number of what goes in to the NBM in AWIPS. So even though, say you look at the European and the GFS and the Canadian, for example, they show one certain scenario, that may not correlate to what you see in the NBM. In fact, sometimes the deterministic models that you see in AWIPS can be the outlier in the NBM. And again, that goes back to the, how is the guidance distributed? Could you have a situation where you have something like a bimodal shown in the lower right? For example, let's take a wintertime scenario. You have one track that favors snow, the other track favors freeze and rain. Those are important things you need to know. So the CRGMAT, here in SSD, other national teams, we're all pushing for some enhanced web-based visualization tools. We need these, and MDL is hearing us. And there's work already started on just looking at Ensemble viewer, and there should be a VLab webinar on that in September for the Ensemble viewer, and then I think the game plan would be to take that to the next level for the NBM. And with capabilities here that would be similar to what we have in ModelCertainty.
Andy, I would just chime in quickly. I don't think that point can be overstated. As I've talked to the SUs, and the SUs, of course, are working with all of you as field forecasters, this is a need that is very well understood, as Andy just said, and all the SSD chiefs across the country are making this point that we need to promote more visualization tools so that people can see the full breadth distribution spread of each element within the NBM, and folks are working on that. It's been heard loud and clear, and it really speaks to the change we're making operationally. 15 years ago, we based our forecast on a couple of deterministic models, and we might nudge it toward an ensemble mean, but today it's much different, and we need to be able to leverage and understand all of the members within the ensembles that comprise the super ensemble known as the NBM. You're not going to be dissecting an individual member of an ensemble, but you need to understand the collective signal from all of the members, and visualization tools will help us do that. So expect to hear more about that as we move forward.
And just throwing out this one last point is that if you haven't looked at it yet, again, from the original transition webinar presentation, take a look at Matt Jeglum's Blue Sky webinar about deterministic versus ensemble. There's some good points in there. So the question is like, okay, what do we do? How do we see what's in the NBM? Well, there are some great tools out here that you can utilize. The first of which noted in again, a lot of these actually noted in the transition webinar, the Ensemble Situational Awareness tool. I can't say how much to, look at this tool. I mean, you get the European Ensemble and the NAICS Ensemble. Looking at the synoptic environment, those two ensembles alone consist of a massive chunk of the NBM. So you can look at these to see if your environment's favorable for some various extreme events, whether it's things like Lawrence Culp, high precip, or winds. ModelCertainty and AWIPS, that's another, or GFE for that matter, it's another great procedure. Again, it's only going to be able to look at the models that are in AWIPS, but still can help you give that quick glance of the distribution of data and also get you familiarized ahead of time when the time comes for that web-based visualization software. Another one, I know I've seen several offices utilize this, so I'm sure some of you are familiar, but if you aren't, the GEFS plumes available here at this website. This is a great place where you can visualize what each ensemble member mean and the deterministic and where they fit within the entire ensemble. And I'm going to take an example. I just came back from Paducah there yesterday and during a meeting, and we happened to have the GEFS plumes open, and I thought it was interesting because here's the plume. The blue is the operational GFS. Gee, that stands out as an outlier. So this is just great to see. Hey, where did that solution fit? In fact, we looked at Kansas City here from the zero-Z cycle today, and it, along with just one other GFS ensemble member, were the same, and the rest was in the same scenario, kind of like this, where it was fitting more of an outlier case. So again, I would recommend to take a look at these ensemble plumes. So other feedback themes here, we'll talk about thunder, winds, more about pops, also some of that, going back to that consistency between SkyPop and QPF, and also about temperature and the diurnal procedure. So thunder continues to be a problem with issues remaining. I think a big point here is to recall that most guidance here, the MOS guide, SREF, and therefore NBM, since those two make a big component of the NBM, are going to be low, especially like for these 3-hour probs, due to the calibration to length. As I mentioned, a 3-hour prob is going to have a lower probability than a 12-hour, for example. And that in the case of the SREF, it needs to have a QPF greater than 100th to produce out a probability. It's then the SREF produces an unconditional probability of thunder, whereas the MOS guide produces more of a conditional. So, and then we have various service programs have different requirements for thunder. Some examples are shown there. So we here at the CRGMAT and SSC have shared a proposal with the NBM Science Advisory Group and the National Forecast Builder team. I think we'll get some work going for NBM version 4. I know that's still, as Bruce stated earlier, is going to be a little ways down the road. But there might be some opportunities here to do some work within Forecast Builder. Another thing to keep in mind is that the MOS guide, which while we have it now, will be going away when 3.2 becomes operational in early November. So at least for right now, while we're still in summer, I think one of the best options is the from pop method. I mean, in general, most precipitation, I know it's not all, but most produces lightning. It's very simple. And if you want to have something that you want to reduce, you know, hey, the cape doesn't look as much, or you know, something of the sort. Maybe you're in a backside of the stratiform, you know, into that stratiform region where lightning is not as expansive. You could go in and limit the values there within the GUI. It's pretty simple, and you can run it over your entire time frame. So I know we've had some back and forth about what is in the NBM for Thunder. In version 3.1, it's a 2/3 SREF with 1/3 grid and MOS blend through day 3. So I remember in the past we had this 50-50 blend of the SREF and the MOS guide. So in this case, the NBM is a little weighted more towards the SREF. So it's weighted more towards the unconditional, and so it's going to end up being a lower probability than what we used to have with the 50-50 blend. It should be noted that after, from day 4 onwards, it's going to transition just to the grid and MOS. When just for your information, when version 3.2 goes operational, we'll also bring in some MOS from the NAM, the GFS, and the European into the equation. And then finally, there's been this remaining experimental Thunder option where we do that 50-50 blend in the MOS guide and the SREF, and bring in some things like pop and lapse rates to help bring some of those probabilities up. I think this is a good option. I think honestly all of them are decent options. In terms of the most simplest, it would be just using the from pop method. So these are all out here. I know it doesn't create a nice consistency map in terms of what we do for Thunder yet. That's still, again, being worked on here between the CRGMAT and SSC and the other national teams. All right, we'll move on to winds. Bruce alluded to some of this already, that we've had 2 issues in NBM 3.1. Both are going to be resolved with 3.2. And again, that's about November 4th, 5th area when that becomes implemented. First of which being discontinuities in the areas of high uncertainty, and that they could be too low at times. I know we've had some of that early feedback. I don't think as much feedback now, but there's been a lot of we'll just tweak this here and here and make all these grids, but it's only like a few knots. And it's been all in a general, seems like a light wind type scenario. Especially, you get out days 4 through 7, a few knots here and there is within the noise of uncertainty. And so really, if it's going to impact your IDSS message, that's the point that we're really trying to make here, then make the modification. But otherwise, it's probably going to be within the noise of uncertainty. But a bigger point here, with respect to that too low aspect, is your mesonet sites, and we strongly recommend blacklisting them, and you work with your SU in doing that. IRMA and again the mesonet sites, play a huge role on why the NBM winds are so low. And there are a couple updates forthcoming, ones to the IRMA and the RTMA. That's in the spring, and then a HER upgrade, also in about the same time frame. So let's take a look at this in an example, and a great one I think that Craven had grabbed. That on the I could probably flip these images, but on the right is a first guess field from the IRMA, which is mostly this first guess field is going to be mostly driven off the HER. But then you look on the left and note how much lighter everything became from that, or went from that first guess field. The Phoenix METAR at this time was reporting 20 knots, and that's kind of at the center of this image. And some of these values, maybe they might be harder for you to see, but there's a lot of these, 0 to 10 knot winds, and a lot of these are just, mesonets maybe with very low anemometer height. Maybe the anemometers themselves are obstructed. So again, strongly recommend going through this process of blacklisting winds. All right, another big topic has been about the extended pops and never wanting to go dry. First point to make here, I could show probably several verification diagrams on this, with the verification from IRMA, or even probably that from a METAR plot, but the NDFD pops have had a significant dry bias for several years, and that's partly driven here by, that we wanted to go to that 14 or that silent pop, not to mention weather. Again, reiterating here that the NBM is a calibrated statistical, data set. It's made up of a lot of ensembles and deterministic models, as we mentioned that we can't see in AWIPS. So why are you seeing these pops out there? Well, it's a combination of a couple factors. The first is the model spread, and then we're in summer and there's moss built into the NBM, and that moss has that climo factor, and so that's going to result in some sort of precipitation chance out there. It's going to be maybe in that 15, or better yet, 10 to 20% chance range. So what do we do? Right now, I would, consider leaving the pops alone. It's really not. This whole thing is really not a pop problem. It's really a weather verbiage problem. Getting all this, the slight chance triggers at 15. There's a couple things that we could potentially, look at here, and I've got a long-term idea, but I think another option here is to utilize your messaging, whether it's in your AFD or whatever, and saying, hey, while we have this, very low chance pop out there, hey, it's either more likely to be dry, it's not likely going to be an all-day washout, or we're just looking at typical summertime pop-up thunderstorms.
Yeah, I'll chime in real quick. I think Andy summarized it pretty well. This is largely going to be a summer issue, given the nature of summertime convection. You're seeing more lower pops than perhaps you've seen in the past or you're comfortable with. The silent 14 pop, quote unquote, has been alive and well in our agency for a while now, where folks have purposefully dropped those pops to make sure it's not mentioned in some of our public products. What's interesting about this is the perception that we're getting too many low pops now is actually not bore out by the statistics that we're running. In fact, it's just the opposite, that a lot of these lower pops that folks think are in way too often are very much justified, and the NBM is far more calibrated than people are giving it credit for. So it's a summertime convection issue. I know that there's a challenge now when maybe some of our partners that have been a little more calibrated to not knowing that they were, receiving forecasts that sort of had that truncation of the very low pops in their summertime forecasts, maybe have the perception that we're over forecasting precip now, but in fact the probabilities are not as off as much as folks believe they are, and in fact they're pretty well calibrated.
Mm-hmm. So it's a lot of communication of, hey, it's only at 20% probability. It's still really a good likelihood it'll be dry. For our mountain offices, they too have had a dry bias in the mountains. There's been a couple reasons to tag on. One is that the radar coverage itself may be, scattered, and so, with that kind of philosophy, usually you might go with a lower pop, as we've all, the directive, old time would say, hey, scattered should be a 30, 40 pop. But, if you have scattered precipitation falling over the course of a 6 or even better yet, a 12-hour period, you're going to get precipitation over a much wider area, so you're more likely going to hit that 100th. It's one of these discontinuities between the actual weather coverage term and the actual pop. And then there's another reason, which is the desire here to emphasize more meaningful rain, because, if you put a 70% chance of rain out there, mentally you might be thinking, hey, it's going to be a washout day. Well, that's maybe in the West, where you're not going to, it can be harder to accumulate a couple hundreds because of how dry the environment is. Maybe a better way here is to communicate, the probability is greater than or equal to 1/10 of an inch, which is usually the definition for a chance of wind and rain. The NBM initialization has led here to higher pops in the mountains, and if I take a look at a reliability plot. This is from MDL's website. Right now, they only have through June. July should come here pretty soon, here later this month. But you know, if you just look at this reliability plot, the gray, which is maybe a little harder to see, is considered a perfect reliable forecast. The NBM that we would populate is in purple. The NDFD is in blue, and you could see that where we have a let's say like a 60 pop, the actual the NDFD here being about 65 to 70. So it's just interesting to look at for the month of June. But if we look at the verification, now I've grabbed from Boulder's verification website, which again you all have your own verification site as well. Looking at the 60-day comparison, going over, and this is from up through August 14th, and look at that. Utilizing the NBM as the common starting point. You're looking at which is verified against IRMA, which is essentially your RSC QPE data. I mean, the forecast, which is, it's verifying extremely well. So that's good to see. Temperature, another area of feedback. When we went to the NBM, it was an opportune time here to switch directly to populating T from the NBM rather than trying to run a diurnal, because the diurnal actually has problems when you run it with the NBM, because the NBM goes from goes from 1 hourly in the short term to 3 hourly later on, and the diurnal procedure can fail. There's been some other problems here with the diurnal tool, verification. We've looked at when running the diurnal procedure is shown to be detrimental to the forecast. When you get into non-diurnal or small temperature change situations, sometimes it will produce splotchy non-meteorological temperature grids, which is really not good in in a mixed precipitation setup, or close to that, because you could get wrong types produced. Unfortunately, no funding currently exists to support the diurnal procedure. So the CRGMAT has recommended to focus more temperature effort here on the individual temperature grids, and then rederive max T min T that way. And again, I think the quickest way to go about this is really to look at where that temperature again is going to impact your IDSS message. Because again, certainly farther out you go in time, you have higher uncertainty, and the forecast certainly changing many times. All right, going back to that topic about POP, SKY, and QPF, since that switch in the NBM, we've kind of, it doesn't have those consistency checks. We actually had some of those built into SuperBlend between POP, SKY, and QPF. Those are gone. So again, opening this question up to just think about this is, do we really need them? Here's again an example. An NBM forecast would come out with mostly sunny with a 50% chance of showers and thunderstorms in the afternoon. Is there anything wrong with that? I could see it. Hey, this is a synoptic situation where you're capped and mostly sunny for most of the day, and then you get some convection towards the end. So if you put that consistency check in there, I don't know if that's good. And then the other thing is here's an environment that you've got favorable for storms to dump a lot of rain, but you only have a few high-res models depicting this. This is kind of a situation we've seen I think several times here in the ESTF period. And so in this situation, your QPF grid comes out high at a half, but your POP is only 20%, because there's questions about cap and enforcing in many of the other models. So, should we increase the POP? Should we lower the QPF? Should we leave them alone? This is just food for thought, things that we're thinking about in SSD and the CRGMAT, and I would say if you guys also look at this as well, just kind of think about it. Is that wrong? So I'll pass it to Audra here briefly.
Thanks, Andy. So as we've been discussing here so far this morning, we've definitely gotten a lot of feedback on issues that are going to be addressed in future versions of NBM with releases in November and then 4.0 later in 2020. But you can also see that the feedback that we've gotten, it's helping to garner really good discussions on just how it is that we're assessing and approaching the forecast process as a whole. Because some of these aspects, it's really, we're looking at the forecast process differently than when we did the forecast 5-10 years ago. So these are really good constructive discussions that we're having on what we really should be focusing on when getting our NBM output and what opportunities we have for improving NBM output so that it's properly matching up with our IDSS messaging. So we just strongly encourage you all to continue to pass on the feedback, positive or negative, whatever it may be, feedback you have on the NBM, feedback you have on Forecast Builder, and even just the forecast process as a whole, because it is your feedback that is ultimately driving change in the NBM process and just the forecast process overall, especially when we're getting feedback from multiple offices, all reporting some similar issues. This is when we're really able to hone in on trends and get some more context with relations to any issues that are coming about. So that feedback goes a long way in helping not only the CRGMAT team, but as they continue to work toward finding resolutions and pushing that on to the developers as well, that context is extremely beneficial. So continue to utilize that feedback form that's available to pass on that feedback you have. And one great capability that now exists in the form is that you can provide images or screenshots into the form. So this is very beneficial, especially if you are trying to capture an issue that you've experienced. That screenshot can be really beneficial in helping to get a better understanding of what it is you're experiencing, and that'll hopefully add more clarity to as their CRGMAT team and developers work on honing in on that issue and seeing how it is that they can assess it further and find potential resolutions moving forward in future updates down the road. So we can't emphasize it enough. Keep the feedback coming. It's been a huge wealth of information, and we want to keep these discussions moving forward so we can continue to bring about positive change in the forecast process. So with that, I'm going to toss it back over to Bruce, and he's going to briefly touch on collaboration and consistency.
Great, thank you, Audra. Yeah, I can't state it any better than that. The feedback is critical. And as Andy noted previously, we've already got 2 success stories that are improvements to future builds of NBM that are a direct result of Central Region feedback. So it's not lip service, this is important. So keep it coming, good, bad, or otherwise, and we'll continue to process and look at all the feedback to make the best use of it and to make improvements going forward. I've got a few slides here to close out this morning's webinar before we open it up for question and answer. I've got a bit on collaboration and consistency, and I'm going to look ahead also to the upcoming winter and how we're going to be handling probability of weather type. What I'm going to share with you now is a graphic that perhaps some of you have seen, perhaps others have not seen. These are being sent twice daily to all of the SUs and MICs across the region. And it's a 9-panel chart, as you can see, pretty busy, but there's a wealth of information here. Across the top row, what we're showing is a comparison of the NDFD at a particular point in the morning with the corresponding NBM output from a similar time in the morning for the first 36 hours of the forecast. So this is the enhanced short-term forecast period, or ESTF part of the forecast. So you see the NDFD, what all of you have contributed to the mosaic across Central Region, what the corresponding NBM forecast was, and then on the far right-hand side, in the upper right, is the delta, or the difference between the NDFD and the NBM. So in this part of the forecast, this is not driven by our RLC agreement. This is not necessarily driven by the NBM. We want forecasters to work hard to put out the best information in the short term they can and work to collaborate it with their partners. So what we look for here is any big discontinuities in the NDFD output where offices have gone out on a limb, either removing precipitation or adding it, and you can see CWA boundaries. And you can see just with the eye test in the upper left, it looks pretty darn good without any WFOs standing out. And you can see in the delta field on the far right, we'll use Missouri and Southern Illinois as an example. You can see some areas there where forecasters went above NBM guidance, and it was very well collaborated from Central Missouri into Southern Illinois. So that's really a success story in spite of the fact that you see deltas. These were collaborated. So I think that's a positive sign of the work you're all doing to produce a collaborated forecast. Now in the middle row, we've got a little longer forecast projection. This goes from 36 hours, the end of the ESTF period, to 72 hours. To me, this is really one of the most important rows of this chart as far as where our operations are today, because this is the overlap of our RLC agreement, which mandates the use of a common starting point, and it's also where QPF then goes out to 72 hours. So it's that 36-hour period, and you can see a very well-collaborated forecast that was largely based on the NBM. So forecasters didn't feel compelled to make sweeping changes to the NBM, and where they were made, they were pretty well collaborated. You can see that Central Iowa lowered some of the NDFD numbers, or I'm sorry, some of the NBM a bit. Looks like by a couple of tenths of a degree, of an inch rather. Arguable whether that's significant enough from an IDSS messaging point, but it was still collaborated with their partners. You don't see any glaring CWA boundaries that stand out. So again, that's the 36 to 72 hour period. And then the bottom row is the difference, the individual forecast and the difference fields between the 0 to 72 hour forecast, but this time it's the NDFD compared to WPC. As many of you know, we're working slowly but surely toward a scientifically sound collaborative forecast process with our national centers, and ultimately this is going to be even more meaningful as we work tirelessly with WPC to start with a common starting point and then make collaborative adjustments based on accepted targets of opportunity. So there are some deltas here between WPC and NDFD. We talk about that on the morning brief when there's big problems sometimes, and we've reached out to offices when there have been collaboration challenges. In this case, WPC is using some higher res output in some of the early parts of the forecast, which is driving some of the differences here. But by and large, you see a well-collaborated forecast with that pocket of precip from parts of Kansas through Missouri into Illinois, as well as some of the precip that extends up into the central and western parts of the Great Lakes. So I share this with you just to let you know that your local managers are receiving this twice a day. And as opportunities arise, they may be sharing this with you to point out real positive efforts you're making to make adjustments where warranted in a collaborative fashion, and then potentially maybe where there's some adjustments that were made that were not well collaborated. So this is certainly intended to be a positive tool to help us continue to promote a consistent, accurate forecast using the NBM as a common starting point and increasingly working with WPC in the future. So lastly, we will look ahead to the upcoming winter. We've alluded to this a little bit already, but I'm going to go into a little more detail. If you think back on how we've operated probability of weather type in previous winters, we've made use of a composite environmental variable approach. And we're going to continue to do that going into the upcoming winter. In the past, we've used what I'll refer to as sort of the legacy environmental variable approach, where we were looking at max wet bulb aloft, probability of refreeze of sleet, based on temperature thresholds. To a large extent. There's a companion technique to that referred to as the Burgoyne or energy method that would transition us to positive energy aloft, negative energy at low levels to replace those two legacy variables. And it's very much akin to the difference between an LI and a CAPE. They really get to the same diagnostic, but they're done in slightly different ways. So we will be switching to the energy or Burgoyne technique region-wide the upcoming winter. We had 13 WFOs that tested that last winter with positive feedback. Training, very comprehensive training, will be provided within the next 6 or 7 weeks to all offices. We're going to provide multiple webinars that will ideally reach out to all the field forecasters. The webinar will be recorded and shared, and there'll be some other documentation going along with that training to make sure that everyone is prepared for the transition. The offices that did it within Central Region last winter found the transition to be very intuitive, very straightforward, and I expect that to be the case for the remaining offices that will move that way this winter. So, largely unchanged from last winter, except that we'll be switching to the energy technique. Now, when NBM 3.2 is delivered starting in November, it will provide its own probability of weather types that are derived within the NBM, not using the composite environmental variable approach. And for reasons I'm going to describe to you, this is expected to be superior to the current method that we've been using because it won't be using a composite sounding that basically is an amalgamation of every individual member in the ensemble. It's going to be looking at each individual member of the super ensemble and assessing the probabilities based on that individual sounding. So let me show a couple of graphics that I think will demonstrate this a little bit more clearly. The first graphic I've got here is what we're doing today and what we've done in previous winters and what we'll do starting this winter. Across the top, you can see 7 individual soundings. Of course, there's many more than that in the NBM, but for the sake of demonstration, I'm showing you just 7. The point here is that we're taking those 7 soundings, each member of the super ensemble, and we're literally averaging that down to a single composite solution that you see in the lower left there. And then we're doing the top-down technique to derive your probability of weather types. Now, if you don't have a lot of spread among your individual ensemble members, there's an argument that that's going to work pretty darn good. But in situations where you've got more spread, and in extreme cases, a bimodal distribution of storm tracks, maybe there's a cluster of solutions that take a storm well to the south, a cluster that take a storm track farther to the north, and if you composite those 2 very different scenarios into a single sounding, you got a scenario that theoretically may not be occurring anywhere in any of the individual models, either deterministic models or ensemble members. So from a statistical mathematical standpoint, this technique has served us well, but it has some questions going forward if it's really the best way to handle probability of weather types going forward. So what 3.2 will do for us now is take each of those individual soundings, and again, you see the 7 there. Of course, it's many, many dozen when you look at the entire NBM. But rather than blending those all together into a single composite sounding, it's going to assess the probability of each weather type based on each individual member. So rather than averaging them, it'll do each one, and then the contribution of each individual sounding will then go toward the NBM 3.2's probability of weather type. So again, mathematically, statistically, probabilistically, this is a far more robust, accurate way to go forward. The challenge we're going to have moving forward, though, then is how do we leverage that in a probabilistic sense and to maintain some of our traditional integrity checks with other elements within GFE. So again, moving forward this winter, we're going to maintain the approach that we did last winter, except move to the energy technique. But concurrently, we're going to look at some potential test beds in Central Region this winter that will look at the best ways to utilize the 3.2 probability of weather types so that we can theoretically, by the end of this winter or winters beyond this, all be embracing 3.2 probability of weather types. So that's kind of a complex topic and really gets into some of the nuts and bolts of how the NBM operates and how we've operated up to this point with Superblend and 3.1. But hopefully that sheds some light on some of the challenges of moving toward a probabilistic data set and how we're going to use that operationally. And then lastly, I'm just going to say a few words about the Enhanced Short-Term Forecast, or the ESTF, for Central Region. We have certainly looked at that previously as a region, and we had a group within our Central Region Grid Methodology team that did just a crackerjack job on this back in 2013, put out some great guidance to promote detailed, accurate short-term weather grids. That's really unchanged. There's been nothing that's replaced that, so we're certainly still encouraging that. But times have changed since then, and we're moving into the NBM era, so it's time to have a fresh look at the ESTF period of the forecast, which is 0 to 36 hours. And we've assembled a team of, or a working group comprised of SUs from our sub-regional SU communities that are working together with the grid methodology team to come up with some best practices. And they've gone out and reached out to most offices to get what they're doing in the 0 to 36 hour time period, getting some best practices. And what we expect going forward is to deliver this ideally in the first half of 2020, fiscal year 2020, that's going to promote the best tools, techniques, encourage the use of NBM, with the ultimate goal to have a consistent approach for maintaining detailed and accurate forecast information in the 0 to 36 hour time frame. And with my boss sitting across the table here, I'm a little embarrassed because I really expected this to be done by this time. That was the plan, but it turned out to be a little heavier lift than we planned. But it's going to be priority number one for the first half of 2020. And the way I looked at it, I talked to Andy about this earlier, you know, we we really were, the NBM itself and getting on that has been really the heavy lift, and making that transition has consumed a lot of our effort up to this point. But I think the ESTF part going forward, together with a collaborative forecast process, are the two next big pieces to help really complete the puzzle here that we're trying to put together to leverage the NBM nationwide for all forecast projections. So again, expect to hear more on that in the months ahead. With that, I'm going to pass it back to Andy, and he can lead Q&A session, so hopefully there are some questions out there.
Thanks to all for sticking around through this. I know it was kind of lengthy, but I do want to open this up for questions. So if you have a question, please put those in the chat. You can put them in the chat window. You can also raise your hand if you want to ask one. So I do see a few questions already in the question box, so we're going to get to them. Again, we have several of our, we have Chuck Greif and Jerry on from the grid methodology team, and Audra on from the culture. So first question from Sioux Falls, from Phil there. Has there been consideration of using GLM data to calibrate probability of thunder? I'm just going to probably stop there in the question. So that is correct. There is a plan to do that. I was talking with SPC, who's been the kind of a lead role in terms of doing the thunder, and he concur. There is that plan on it, but right now it's just there's a lot of data, and they just got to grab. They have to do a couple of. They have to get a couple of years worth of data, and the GLM is still fairly new. I think when they did the current probabilities of thunder, they did I think they used 3 years worth. So, all right.
Oh. The next, are you doing that one?
Let's do this one.
Yeah. The next one here, I'll address that one, the next one real quick here, which is really more of a comment than a question. And I'll just leave it at that. Basically, the sentiment here is we spend so much energy on this. Who cares about the National Weather Service about POPs? We should put out what the POP is in every period and end this nonsense. So we are adjusting sort of legacy thresholds and legacy thinking and how we've communicated some of this information. And I agree. It's a transition we're making. It's a cultural change, but it really speaks exactly to the challenges of going to a fully calibrated probabilistic system. And we have sort of been our own worst enemy here by trying to hide the public from legitimate 18 and 20 POPs to not make it sound too wet. So there's a science component to this, there's a culture component to this, and there's an education component to this. So we're going to continue to move forward with it, but I agree. As long as we have calibrated probabilities and we continue to work toward the best calibration possible, then we need to find the best way to communicate it.
This next question, I think it's a good one about the next chat about being that one example I provided earlier about you have a low pop, say like 20%, but your QPF is a ½ inch. Isn't it? In that example, isn't more of this QPF issue is more of a probability issue. That maybe the better way to handle this is to have a conditional and unconditional QPF. The unconditional would be near zero, i.e. the most likely QPF, but the conditional might be at 1 1/4 inches. I think that is a good idea. And you're right. I mean, it could result in a poor river forecast by overdoing the areal extent of a ½ inch. So that's something that we can. I think it might be worth. I'll see about interacting with the MDL group about that, as well as the NBM SAG, that because I know I've seen this most often in the ESTF period when the high-res models can tend to overwhelm because of the fact that the QPF grid only goes from its back end starts at 0, and so when you're doing all this blending, you don't have like negative numbers there to help bring down those higher QPFs down. It's only a 0, so those high-res models result in a lower weight or higher weight. So yeah, I'll bring that up. That's a great point. Next question here, is the snow level option still going to be an option with the new tech order? That is correct. That will still be an option. We're going to leave that for our mountain offices. Next one on, could you give the way to blacklist wins? Yes, I will. I will send here after the webinar the link for the SUs, because again, the idea here was for the SUs to be the ones collecting the information for blacklisting. That was recommended by, I think that was the NCEP modeling group, or whoever, not the modeling group, but whoever owns this. So anyway, I remember it was NCEP anyway.
And Andy, I would also throw in there, Jeff Craven will be here for the upcoming Central Region SUE conference at the end of September, and I've asked Jeff specifically to be very forceful, as Jeff can be, on the blacklist issue. So he'll also provide any answers to questions you've got on the technique and ways to blacklist, the procedures for that. So you'll be hearing more about that, SUE as well, in the next month and a half.
Yeah. Next question is about, will WPC be starting with NBM this winter, since they have transitioned over to GFE, which will make collaboration on snow and ice amounts easier, which I believe the QPS fields are going to be.
The NBM is foundational to all of what WPC does. What they do, though, at various forecast projections is work in some additional high-resolution data in different ways than we're doing it in the NBM. So we've been talking to the folks at WPC, and their ultimate goal is to start with the same starting point that we are. There will be some gyrations for us to get there, because we're trying to change their culture as well as move toward the common starting point agency-wide here. That is our goal for sure, and you'll be hearing more about this as we begin to work toward the collaborative forecast process with WPC.
Bruce, I think that's a good point. This is Chris. Just as we've been working to change our culture to move in toward this, WPC has been doing the same thing, and they are trying to meet us in the middle here. So I've been really encouraged by where they've come, how far they've come over this past year, and working with Dave Novak, I think we'll be seeing that in the future, even more so.
Yeah. They were a bit reluctant on the NBM in the very early stages here, but they recognize the value and the importance of us all starting from the same discussion point to work toward one forecast. So it's maybe not as quick as we would like it, but they are ultimately working toward starting with the NBM in its true form, just as we are. And they are using it now, but it's foundational, and it may not be 100% of what they're starting with.
Yeah, I like this next question, and thank you for bringing it up. We have to constantly modify temperature grids to account for the inland lakes problem of resolving temperatures 5 degrees or more too cool. Is there a fix coming for this? The answer is yes. Unfortunately, not fast enough. This is one that we brought, and I actually should have had. I thought I actually had it in the feedback webinar. So thank you again for bringing it up. We here at SSD, as well as Sue's passing this along, and through the feedback forums, we saw this, and thank you all for that. And we brought this up through we had a long thread here with the HER and IRMA groups. The actual issue relies with the HER, and you can see that in AWIPS if you look at the HER. The new HER, which you can also see in AWIPS, although I think there's an outage right at the moment, the Ezreal HER will show that it's got it fixed. The issue is that because of moratoriums right now that are on the supercomputers, that new HER is not going in until late spring of next year. So it's going to be a while before that is fixed. There are a few offices that have had some kind of sort of Band-Aid approaches, if you will, to this. And I'm contemplating whether or not to put them right into Forecast Builder, or as a, just at least delivering the tool to everybody via tech order. So expect that probably to come in soon. I know we're kind of coming out of the summer, but I think this problem may reverse itself here as we go into the fall, where the lakes will show up being too warm, and we end up with the inlands are more realistic. So yeah, be looking for that. I'll see about, at a minimum, getting some tool out there for everybody until they can get
Andy.
Yep.
Hey, Andy, this is Jerry. I just wanted to also comment that, yeah, it will reverse. We saw this here in Milwaukee area where during some of those early season or late season snows, where our temperature grids were 34 over the lake, we basically would have 0 snow being forecasted. So outside of the lake areas, we would get 6-8 inches of snow, and then right over the lake we would get nothing. So it is an important thing that we are going to work on. The GMAT is discussing this, and we're going to have to get something out to the field as a Band-Aid type fix. It's not going to be the fix, as Audra had mentioned, but we have to put a Band-Aid out for this one.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. All right, a good one from Boulder. Are you really pushing us to edit hourly temperature grids because we don't have a tool to do this a better way, which seems contradictory to our efficiency goals? And can we find a better solution? I know. I think especially for the mountain offices, I understand how much more difficult it can be for editing an hourly temperature grid. So you're gonna probably be stuck with running the diurnal and having to realize that there are these issues. I wish we could get funding again for the diurnal. I mean, we could try to resurrect and try and develop one. It's a lot of effort, and I don't know if you get the bang for the buck. I don't know. Jerry, you got any thoughts on this? Certainly from more on the CRGMAT side. I mean, and how I know that your office has been doing this for a while with editing hourly temperatures too, so you might have some tips and tricks.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things that, I myself have been keeping an eye on verification. I know it's a hard thing. I'm an ITO, so I'm not sitting on that forecast desk having to deal with it. But the simple fact of the matter is the NBM is putting a lot of time, a lot of effort into creating the best hourly temperature forecasts. It calibrates them, and it is trying hard to create the best ones. So their hourly forecasts just are better and far superior to using the diurnal tool. It verifies a lot better. You can see it even on the NDFD. So here I know what we tend to do is we are looking at, when improvements are made or needed to be made, we're looking at the temperature grid, making the modifications there, and then, a final check on the max T min T to make sure they fall within the thresholds of where the temperatures are, so that we're not forecasting an hourly temperature greater than or less than what a max T or min T would be. I know it's not necessarily the answer most folks are going to be looking for. They want, max T and min Ts obviously are easier to modify. This has been a topic, an ongoing topic with the GMAT. We're trying to figure out ways to help you guys. We understand. It's there, but the simple stats, no matter what way you look at it, show that the NBM and, pretty much any blend of model temperatures end up being superior to using that diurnal tool. So, this is an ongoing thing that the GMAT has. We hear you. We understand what you're saying. But, the way it's being done right now is that, if you see that diurnal day, we have the diurnal tool available. Andy mentioned some of the problems that happen. And, we're going to work on this. So that's about what I can say.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. Yeah, well, Chuck, do you have anything else to add? You good too from the CRGMAT?
Yeah, just that we definitely. One of my problems is that for years and years and years, that was the go-to tool. You would edit your max and min temperatures throughout the forecast, and then that would kind of take care of things for you. So it's understandable that is definitely something we would love to see fixed and improved. But yeah, when you look at the statistics side, you look at the verification side, the hourly from especially the new models are really blowing us away using that tool. I would suggest that you still use that tool if you've made large enough changes that it's going to really affect your hourly temperatures. But Otherwise, try to avoid it if possible, just because of the other problems it causes. And specifically, the problems happen when you've got a non-diurnal curve that can really cause some trouble. And you've got kind of flat diurnal curves that will cause some trouble too, where it's just unrealistic hour-to-hour type of temperatures coming out of that thing. And it's a known problem, but like Jerry says, and I believe that the developer of that is retiring this year, so that makes it even more complicated. Even if we could find some funding, I'm not sure if he has enough time to even fix it. So yeah, it's a tough issue, that's for sure.
Yeah. Thanks, Chuck. All right, from Chicago, kind of back to that blacklist and mesonet sites. The best process for blacklisting, because they've been experiencing systematic errors with the winds over the metro regularly. I guess the best process, I know probably a lot of you are still utilize the AWIPS grid QC process. You can almost utilize that as seeing, okay, what do we have currently blacklisted for winds? Might be worth cross-checking to see are those still valid, or just even over, take a look at IRMA, look at the IRMA winds, and see if you have these low bias areas, and just kind of correlate that back to your mesonet sites. You might even be able to do a nice overlay in D2D with IRMA wind overlay with your all surface data.
Hey Andy, this is Jerry again. I did want to comment on this. We did that here at Milwaukee. We went back to the AWIPS Grid QC program for this very specific reason. And basically, we all had, we had blacklisted things years ago. So we basically turned off the blacklisting, and got us back to ingesting everything for the AWIPS database. And then we went through and wanted to make sure we had the most accurate list. So if things ended up being bad, then, we would blacklist them again. And so now we're gathering that list of sites that we can then send back in. This is done through our Opal and the Sioux here. So that's a process that I would recommend. It took us a bit. We broke down our counties and went county by county to look at some of these mesonet sites and just to make sure which ones were going well. So I agree. I think that AWIPS Grid QC program, while it's old, it's been around for a long time, and you're sort of re-looking at that AWIPS database, it does give you an avenue to exactly see which one might have, which OB may have negative impacts on an analysis. Because if it's going to have a negative impact on the AWIPS database, it will also have it on the IRMA. So AWIPS database really is only used right now if folks want to populate with it. It's not used for verification. And we try to recommend people actually use the RTMA to do their population. So it's sort of a playground grid right now that folks could use to try to isolate some of these bad sites.
Awesome. Let's see. Next one, I think from Chanhassen, and I think I like this idea here. So with regard to this summer kind of messaging, these mostly sunny with a 50% chance of showers and thunderstorms, like I said in my example, with trying to eliminate legacy products like the ZFP, aid in better forecast messaging, since the NBM is focused on these 1 to 3 hour type forecasts, while the ZFP and other legacy products focus on 12-hour messaging. I don't think that's a bad idea. I mean, obviously, a lot of us should be trying to think about point and click and hourly graphs, the NDFD itself. So that is something moving forward. I mean, I have to say, as we've gone through all this, the feedback that you've provided, going into all this stuff with the NBM, it's really starting to open up some thoughts about the service side and how we've done things. I mean, you can already take the weather grid, for example. The weather grid was created as sort of a catch-all, taken from what we used to do back in old C11, back in the 90s and that, and even prior, and we really haven't done anything with that grid, and we're trying to cram what we're starting to move to this probabilistic process into something that's not made for it, that's completely not made for it, and so I could see a lot of potential service changes ahead, which I know they take some time to get through. Got to start them now, but I think that's just been kind of an amazing part over these last couple of months that we're really digging into these things, and that we're going to need bigger changes ahead.
Yeah, I would just jump on that. It's amazing how this has become more and more of a theme the last couple of months. We're looking at it from STI, science and technology integration, and thinking about the science behind the NBM and GFE to get us where we need to go to deliver probabilistic forecasts. But it's increasingly becoming a service issue as well that would bring in the ISD side of the house and hopefully make some changes from their perspective for the reasons that Chanhassen brings up there. We're in some ways trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, and we're increasingly running into problems here. So I would hope that I would hope that there aren't officers or forecasters that are getting too wrapped around the axle based on legacy products, and that's preventing them from moving forward with really moving to the higher resolution probabilistic type information we're moving toward. Those things are going to spit out what they spit out right now, and ultimately, though, we need to find the best way to replace those legacy tools and delivery methods with stuff that really leverage the temporal and probabilistic nature of the data we're trying to push forward.
All right, good question from Omaha. With the impending probability weather type updates, will there also be a probability of drizzle calculated in the same non-composite method to complement the prob type? Currently, the composite prob ice present is one of our most difficult elements of the winter forecast process. Prob ice present needs to stay in both methods, both from top down to Burgoyne. So there's no change with that. So we can still create the drizzle from that. Again, here's another point. I mean, the NBM is only going to create rain, snow, sleet, freeze, and rain. So any drizzle would come into the freeze and rain category. So essentially, coming back to this is that yes, prob ice present still around. We can still generate drizzle through that method. I should make a note in NBM 3.2 because they had noticed, and I think we probably noticed the same thing in the field, that including some of the prob ice present farther out in time. In the case of the NBM 3.2, it's beyond 48 hours. That the prob ice present is not going to be included. So essentially it turns into slightly more of an ESTF deal, and I think that's probably okay because it creates just a lot of icing that may or may not occur. I think that there'll be a little more lead to more confidence of having icing in the ESTF. All right. From Des Moines, a bit concerned about the change to Burgoyne. Would like to see training released ASAP. And then beyond the webinars, are there plans to give forecasters the ability to practice on AWIPS or the West? I mean, Bruce, you could attest to this one. I mean, I can mention here that, yeah, I mean, the best year that we're going to try and get the training out here in September. We've actually have a lot of the training still from during the test beds, and then a majority of that is still applicable here with this. I mean, the only really major difference is switching to the NBM from what we had before. So I think that's going to be pretty minor.
I would just also say, Mike, I certainly hear you as far as concern about making sure we've got our ducks in a row in this. I certainly respect that. I can tell you that Eric Lenning in Chicago led the charge on this last winter. As I said, we had 13 FOs that used the energy Burgoyne method last year. The transition was very smooth and transparent. With transparent, there were some changes for the forecasters thinking, but it was very intuitive for them to make the change. Now, I personally wasn't in office doing it, so I'm taking his word for it, and the offices that provided feedback to Eric. We will provide the training in September. Eric will take the lead on that with the webinars, and you'll have the tech order component to it. And then I also have a short summary of the test bed from last winter that looked at the energy Burgoyne method that, again, Eric did a crackerjack job putting together for us. And I'll share that as we move forward with this, so you'll have a little bit more background about the offices that went through this last winter.
And here, that you also mentioned that about the plans to give forecasters the ability to practice on AWIPS or the West. I believe that will still be there as well, kind of just like what we did before. We'll just have another case in a net CDF. You have one other point here about progress on the wintry mixed weather type issue. Yes, there has been, and it's kind of going to be coming out at the same time with this for Burgoyne switch, and we're going to release this. I mean, we'll talk about it in the webinar, but I'll just allude to it now. Is this probably a weather type limiter grid, which allows you to limit the probabilities that will get mentioned from the types. So rather than, I know in the past that people may have wanted to go in and modify the actual type grids, for example, this grid will allow you to just say, hey, anything less than a 30% chance of a precipitation type, I don't want to have mentioned. And that will automatically help to reduce the p-types. And I think it's going to be great to have this with NBM 3 too, with the different, and if we do get to explore like a test bed row, that will be good to have.
And I think maybe the spirit of the question though was more of a service issue where we actually, in the formatters, look at these freezing rain, sleet, snow scenarios, and the formatter physically recognizes that it's going to create a weather type of wintry mix. That would be a great endpoint for all of this, and that's a much heavier lift, and it really is very much a service issue that Mike Hudson is aware of, and he's communicated that elsewhere. I have no clue if or when there'll be traction on it, though.
Yeah, and I communicated up to as well to national headquarters, and I think they got it. We had we shared our proposal from the that we did here from CRGMAT and SSD and the small Sioux group. So hopefully it will happen. But again, that's going to take a couple years to at least make its way through if it happens. Jerry, this is going to be, I think, a good question for you maybe. Is there any plan to have model certainty like plots for the members of the NBM, since we do not have access to all the guidance at the WFO? I believe, from what I've seen, that is the case. I know that's what we've been pushing. Jerry, have you heard otherwise? I don't think.
I've been trying. I know that there is a group at MDL right now that is working on this topic. I don't know. They're going to have a hard time doing what I can do in ModelCertainty, but it will be something close. So I'm hopeful that we can get some of the, edit area or point and click style of, select a grid point and get a box plot type thing. It'll be interesting to see if they'll be able to show all of the individual guidances going into it. I know what they have right now for the Ensemble viewer does have something like that, but the NBM is a different beast, and most of that data is all sort of self-contained within their system. So, I know that they understand what ModelCertainty does. I've been briefing people up there on that. So hopefully they can give us something close. And I know they understand the reasons why. So, it's just going to take a little bit of time. Just like the rest of the field, MDL has been hit with, missing personnel and that kind of thing. So it'll take a little bit of time for them to get it. But hopefully once we get version 4.0 out there of NBM, sometime thereafter, they may have something for us.
Yeah, so in the interim, like going back to the tools, utilize those three reference: the ModelCertainty, the Ensemble situational awareness viewer, and the the GEFS plumes.
And the good thing is with ModelCertainty, it does, every one of the models that go into ModelCertainty are part of the NBM. So it is a subset of those models. We don't have, obviously, all the models. We have the main deterministic or control member of the models, but it will give you a feeling for how things are, how the distribution goes. So that was the point of model certainty, is to sort of get our foot in the door, get ourselves used to using this data, so that once we are given that NBM 4.0 fully probabilistic data set, we might be able to, run and go with it.
Awesome. And I think somewhat of a related question to all this from Grand Forks, any chance that we can add some of the members of the NBM we currently don't receive to the Central Region LDM feed? That, unfortunately, is going to be a no. And unfortunately, a lot of what the things that we don't, the things that are in the NBM that make up the good chunk are the ensembles. And even if we got all that, it would be hard to, I don't even know if the capability is there in AWIPS to really visualize. We'd have to develop that. So I think we're just going to have to kind of, unfortunately, wait, but again, utilize those tools that we have to this point to kind of go for being able to look at what's inside the NBM.
Yeah, and this is Jerry again. The unfortunate thing is our DX3s and DX4s are already starting to blow smoke with all of the processing that we're doing. If we had a couple extra of those servers, we might be able to get it done. But they're already starting to, there are times where changes are made in the baseline, and you can immediately see the impact on those machines because of how much data we're chugging through there. So it's when Andy and I and others put new model sets on the LDM, we're doing it with a lot of testing to make sure it doesn't impact the system. So that it's a hard sell, and that's why we're so hopeful that they may be able to provide something like model certainty on a web-driven page, and we can utilize and see the data that way.
Yeah, I think certainly with the NBM, it's going to have to be a lot more web visualization, looking at even the href. You could take that, for example. I know we have stuff in AWIPS to visualize that, but I know that there's some good visualization stuff on from SPC's website. So I think the web could become a bigger thing to be looking at for a lot of this forecast information, especially when it relates to NBM. Another question, this one might be good for you, Jerry or Chuck, is why not just create max T and min T as usual, then use NBM for hourly T, and then run a consistency check? Wouldn't that work? And I know that's what I've been
at Milwaukee. Yeah. So yes.
Yeah. And so that's what I'm thinking about doing for Forecast Builder as well, is adjust that so that it would, make sure that the max T is at, above the maximum of the hourlies. Same thing with the min T, but within some sort of a threshold, because you wouldn't want the max T to be like 10 degrees or something above the maximum of the hourlies. That seems a little too high.
And Andy, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't there some feedback recently about offices that had concern to that effect with respect to heat indices were falling out of the temperature dew point database, and they weren't high enough.
Yep, exactly. And so I don't think there's any problem with this heat indices stuff to, in your MPW to have a higher heat index than what's referenced in your actual apparent temperature grids. Again, this is another one of these probably service areas that we have to address. All right, another one related to wind. It says, have you heard of anything about the problem with valid mesonet wind knobs and high wind events getting thrown out because it exceeds the QC with the IRMA first guess, and this causes much bigger underestimations of the NBM and high wind events? I personally have not heard this. but what I will do is I will check in with the IRMA RTMA group on this and get their thoughts and see what we can do. Because yeah, I mean you're right. I mean certainly I know from your CWA that you can get some really high winds, and we wouldn't want that. Wouldn't want that happening. So, all right. That was great. Thank you all for all those questions. I know we've gone we're already we're on 35 minutes on the questions, and that's awesome. Does anybody else have any other questions? Feel free to raise your hand, enter it in the chat. I'm willing to stay on as long here as needed. As is sure others. Well, we're not seeing any other questions, so again, please continue on with the feedback form. I know we've got several proposals we're working through here. I know for some of you, some of this change is maybe not happening, as fast as you want. There's a lot of different things that are being impacted, and some are just unfortunately big issues that require big change. So we're doing it, please understand we're doing what we can, whatever with these issues, whatever best we can do. Anyway, all right. Well, thank you all for attending, and we'll talk to you again soon with some of the Burgoyne switchover stuff.
Thanks, everyone.